At long last, we arrive at the Borromean knot. Borromeo, Borromeo, wherefore art thou, Borromeo? He's right here. He ain't much of a knot, though. It's really a link of sorts, a linkage of sorts. But nevertheless, Lacan here, in Lesson 3 of Seminar 21, is messing with it as a Borromean knot. It's in Lesson 2 as well. But for us, the rubber hits the road in Lesson 3. Check this out. The imaginary, Lacan tells us. The symbolic, Lacan tells us. That is not enough, he says in Lesson 3 of Seminar 21. The third element is necessary, and I designate it by the real. Page 72 in our packet. And I quote one more time. The imaginary, the symbolic, that is not enough, Lacan says. The third element is necessary, and I designate it by the real. Only the third, Lacan continues, knots the two others. It is from the third that the two emerges, he adds, and I think this is a terrific addition because it allows us to state the issue even more radically. It's not just that the real is the third which knots the other two together, symbolic and imaginary, in a Borromean knot. Nah, man, it's that the third as linkage is precisely what allows the other two to emerge. Lacan is plain. This is exactly what he says. It is from the third that the two emerge. Note this emphasis on thirdness. If you attended our last series on television, you know where I'm headed with this. Our point of access to the real is not just an estimate limit in the symbolic, in the imaginary, but also, far more crucially, it is the very basis for their linkage. To illustrate this, let's start off right from the beginning by drawing one of these Borromean knots, or at least trying to do so. It would be easier to use rings of string, I imagine, but I like the challenge of trying to draw this thing on the screen. And it's not as simple as just overlaying three circles, drawing three circles that intersect. There's a technique to drawing this thing that actually shows you how it operates. First, what we draw is one circle atop a second circle, with breaks in the second circle to indicate the overlayment of the first. So check it out. Our second circle, going to draw here, and then the circle that overlays it, we can draw right next to it. And notice, the yellow circle overlays the purple circle. And visually, what you see is a break, two breaks, in the purple circle, constituted by the overlayment of the yellow. You see how that works? One circle overlaying another. This is the start to drawing one of these things. And then we add that crucial third circle, which passes over the first, the yellow circle, and thereby introduces breaks into it, but under the second circle, thereby revealing breaks in itself. So let's see if we can do this. We add another circle here that passes over the first and thus introduces breaks there, but under the second, the purple, over the first, under the second, and voila. Now what you have on the screen is a Borromean knot, with that third element, that third ring here as the real, doing the very crucial work of overlaying the yellow, underlaying the purple, and thus establishing a linkage between the two. Now, were we to use rings of string instead, we wouldn't need to talk about all these breaks in the circles and the like. Part of what's happening here is that because we're drawing the Borromean knot on a screen, on a pen tab, etc., not in 3 dimensions, but instead in 2 dimensions on the flat impacted surface here that you see known as your screen, we are effectively rendering it as an image. Note this. We use these breaks in the circles on your screen to create the illusion of volume. The illusion, in other words, of 3-dimensionality. That's why it's drawn the way it is. And that's why I tell you it's not just as simple as overlaying 3 circles. It's not just as simple as drawing 3 circles, whether it's for the Olympics or that Audi of yours. It's about drawing them in such a way that shows a series of over and underlayments that establishes linkages. Linkages such that if you were to cut or break any one of these 3 rings, the other 2 would fall apart. That's the crucial element here, clinically speaking. You see, there's a little more to this illustration than just the priority on thirdness, here represented by the red circle, red for real, that links the other 2 together. What I'm trying to talk to you about here, on the sidelines of this Borromean knot, as it's called, is what meaning making is all about. Meaning making as an act of enciphering looks just like this. It provides an illusion of volume, depth, and 3-dimensionality. Just like that illusion of depth, volume, and 3-dimensionality that we typically attach to our notions of reality. Even going so far as to make it physical, when in fact, as Lacan borrowing from Freud reveals, it is psychical instead. Let me be clear. In dreams, in language, and on the screen in front of you, hell, perhaps even in the sketchbook, because I'd like to think you drew this thing with me at the same time. In dreams, in language, on this screen, on your screen, in your sketchbook, and mine alike, it's all about image generation. Until, of course, it's not. And that is the point. That certain point that we've been discussing. That certain point that allows us to touch upon the real toward which the analytic discourse is always angling us. And for this point, I think we need more than just the image, even so artfully drawn as the one on your screen. We need more than a diagram. We also need the concept. What then is the concept in question here? The key concept in all of this is thirdness. I've often told you that for Lacan, 1 + 1 always equals 3. I'm not going to tell you different here. Why do I keep saying this? 1 + 1 equals 3 in Lacanian theory and technique. Because in order to have anything like a single entity, Lacan realizes that you also have to have an objective field in which this entity appears, a background of sorts that conditions its foregrounding as a singular entity. In other words, a background that this foregrounded entity is not. Do you remember the pen and the wall behind it that we used to talk about in previous lecture series? How about the part of truth that can be said against the backdrop of the part that cannot? What about the symptom as commanded by the unconscious? And how about more recently in our lectures, about language emerging out of the vast impregnable background known as la langue? And don't even get me started, again, on love letters. That has been a central topic. I wouldn't say central, maybe another one of them sideline topics, a gutter topic, you might even say, ever since we started working through those walls of the clinic. How about feminine enjoyment? That's another recent one for us where we do indeed see thirdness. Aha, but notice, some but not all feminine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. You got a some and you've got a not all, but there's always a but. And that tells us there's a third. I don't have time to rehearse all this. You might not have patience to hear me rehearse all this. This is all stuff that we've covered. Each of those points are points that we've covered in detail, even as recently as our last series on television. Indeed, there's no need for us to rehearse all this, since this is precisely where our series on television started. In a lecture, Lecture 1, that is freely and fully available to you online. Rehearsals galore. Just check out Lecture 1 in our series on television, and you'll see us walking through each of these examples. The key insight that you'll see there, and that I want to bring forward into our conversation of Seminar 21 here, is that all of these supposed dyads, where you see two elements, they are in fact actually triads instead. There's some and there's not all, but there's also a but. This is not a dyad, it is instead a triad. You see, in order to have one, you must first have two. But to turn the Lacanian screw to its proper depth, we have to add this. Wherever two have gathered, there will always be a third. That's the key move here. In order to have one singular entity, you must have another that it is not. And in order to have those two, there must be a third that marks their relation, even if only by way of a gap, cut, or fissure that comes to us in the form of a non-relation, as we're going to see. What then is this third element that can link but also disconnect, that can serve as a relationship but also in a certain non-rapport status? How are we to make sense of all of this stuff? It's confusing as hell. What is this third element betwixt and between the two? I've often told you that it's a differential relation that simultaneously links and divides the two entities. And I've often used the algebraic term little a to designate this. This is the definition of objet A that I've been peddling for years now, drawing and dragging it through all of our series, I would imagine. You see, in Lacanian Psychoanalysis, and this hasn't changed, despite the numerous permutations he has put little a through, in Lacanian Psychoanalysis, object little a is the algebraic symbol that we use to designate the minimum irreducible difference between any two entities that allows them to appear distinct. So, is it a relation? I mean, kind of, but also kind of not. It's an opening, it's a gap, it's a break, even an impasse between. So see, you can now understand why so many Lacanians want to assign it to lack. And I join them in that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Little a is a designation of lack. But in order to understand lack, we have to understand its relation to loss. That was some of the early work that we did in lectures on Lacan. So it's never just about lack, objet a as lack, as cause of desire. I don't think that's quite sufficient here. What we're talking about more broadly and more technically is the emergence of a gap, a break, an opening, a caesura. That's what objet a designates. It signals an opening that typically serves as an impasse. Think chasm. Think bottomless crack, if you like. And definitely think thirdness. Objet a for Lacan always marks a third element, a third space, which is neither the one nor the other. And that logic is one that has been with him for decades at this point, and with each of our series on Lacan's work as well. So, this thirdness that we're looking at, it is neither the pen nor the wall, but the minimum irreducible difference or distance between the two that allows them to appear distinct on the screen in front of you right now. It is also neither the truth said nor the truth unspoken, but instead a third element, the minimum irreducible difference between the two parts of truth that allow us to have two parts of truth. It is also neither symptom nor unconscious, but a space in between, however liminal. It is neither language nor Lalong. The thirdness that we are looking at here is the minimum irreducible difference between these two fields that allows them to appear as two fields. And again, don't get me started on those love letters. I am not talking about my love letter here, nor am I talking with you about the depths from which it springs eternal. I am talking with you about a third element that marks the line, if you will, between the love letter you've read and the depths from which it sprang that not even I know. And again, this is neither the sum nor the not all of feminine enjoyment relative to the phallic field. It is not the one or the other, but something else. That is the third element. That is the element of thirdness that is the central concept in Lacan's thought right now. So let's see if we can put a bumper sticker on this thing. What is this third element, this third space, this opening, gap, rapport, or non between two entities? It's the difference. Maybe even the pure difference. It's the distance, absolutely irreducible, between the one and the other. In each of these sets that we've worked through, pen and wall form a set. Truth spoken and truth said. Truth unsaid and truth these are sets. And in each one of them, there is at least another third element. That's what we're getting at here. The difference or the distance between the two apparently dyadic elements in this set is itself another element to be brought into the set. That's the loopy line of thought that Lacan's working here. But he's also very crisp in summarizing what it means. When we focus on the difference or the distance between the one and the other in each of these sets, a difference or distance that is neither the one nor the other? Lacan says this means we can count to 3. In fact, here's how he puts it, which allows you right away to count to 3. It's a brilliant move. You can see it right in Lesson 3 of Seminar 21. I think it's one of the most eye-opening passages at the start of this Seminar 21. And I think it's eye-opening because you've probably heard that in order to be a good Lacanian, you need to be able to count to 4. I don't think that's true. On the contrary, being a good Lacanian means reading Lacan well and attending to what he actually says, not what some secondary commentator tells you Lacan is all about. I quote from page 69 of our version of Seminar 21 in this spirit. The further I go, the more I am convinced that we only count up to 3. This is what Lacan tells us at the start of Seminar 21. The further I go, the more I am convinced that we only count up to 3. Now, this is Seminar 21. Maybe by Seminar 22, maybe somewhere in Seminar 23, and so on. Maybe he'll change his mind and say, actually, 4 is the magic number. But for now, and in a for now that lines up with his entire thought up to this point, the magic number is not 4, but 3. And Lacan is explicit about it in this moment. It's all about learning how to count to 3. Why? Because he's convinced at this point in the winter of 73 that that's as far as we only count. We only ever count to 3. It's an interesting move indeed, straight from the man's mouth. So let's take a moment here and see if we can count to 3 with Lacan, as he saw fit to do in this winter, in this 3rd lesson of his 21st seminar. Not coincidentally, I would add, Lacan begins by recalling that riddle we've been discussing, the riddle he introduces us to at the start of Seminar 21. It's the riddle of enciphered linguistic meaning versus the decipherings of unconscious knowledge. Remember that riddle? He's back at it again. Check out with me, for instance, pages 68 to 69 of our beloved packet. And really that's what we mean when we say this is a beloved seminar. We're talking about the beloved packet that we're working with here, which is not quite the standard English translation, but I would just say an English translation. Side note, in the spirit of gutters, why on earth hasn't more of this stuff received an adequate published translation? Ask yourself, what's the holdup here? Every other major French thinker from this period has long had their works translated, established in lots of different languages, foremost among them typically English. Why is there no adequate, complete, standard English translation of so many of Lacan's works? Talk about knowledge and power. There's a good question to put you on the path. Unfortunately, though, again, you're going to wind up in the gutters if you walk it. But here we are, nevertheless, in a workable translation for which I am grateful, on page 68 at the bottom. Check this out. I never said that it is language that is knowledge, Lacan begins. Language, if you do not mind remembering some of the things I drew on the board when I had the energy for it. Language is an effect of the fact that there is something of the signifier one. But knowledge is not the same thing. Knowledge is the consequence of the fact that there is another. And so, in appearance, that gives two. For this second holds its status precisely from the fact that it has no relationship with the first, that they do not form a chain, even if I said somewhere in my scribblings, the very first ones, function and the field was not all that stupid. In function and field, I perhaps slipped in that they formed a chain. That is an error, because to decipher, I had to make some attempts. Hence this stupidity. It is what is proper to deciphering. When one deciphers, one confuses things. And this is even how I did indeed manage, all the same, when all is said and done, to know what I was doing. Again, we land on the question of deciphering. To decipher, I've told you, is to reverse the effects of enciphering. It's to decompose imaginary compositions, to liquidate frozen gestalts of all kinds. It's to disfigure established and ostensibly stable figurations. Where completion, consistency, coherence, singularity, and above all oneness were, incompletion, inconsistency, incoherence, division, and multiplicity become. I would even put this more starkly, and by starkly I mean meontologically. Where being was, non-being becomes. That is what is up with deciphering. Which is partly what Lacan means in this passage we just read, when he says, when one deciphers, one confuses things. Remember, though, this is typically not how we understand deciphering, to say nothing of the encipherings on which it operates. Remember, to encipher typically means to encrypt, and thus to confuse. And to decipher typically means to decrypt, and thus to clarify. But remember, once again, this is important to understanding how Lacan's thinking through this. For him, their roles are reversed. Enciphering for Lacan yields imaginary clarity. Deciphering for Lacan, on the contrary, introduces us to real confusion. But also, remember, we're just trying to count to 3 here, my friends, so let's get back to work. Linguistic meaning, with all of its encipherings, gives us the signifier one. Let's call it S1. This is how Lacan begins the passage we just read. That signifier one that he attaches to language is the S1 that we often see throughout his formulations. Unconscious knowledge, with all of its decipherings, however, gives us another, which, in appearance, Lacan specifies, gives us two. Call this another S2. Note the moves. Note how this is shaping up here. You've got your S1 attached to linguistic meaning, and you've got an S2 signaling unconscious knowledge. Between these two signifiers, as it were, this S1 and this S2, between linguistic meaning and unconscious knowledge, enciphering and deciphering. Lacan says in the passage we just read that he no longer sees a chain. Nor does he even say there's a differential relation between these two. Instead, and as you know, he's been saying this louder and louder ever since Seminar 20. Instead, he tells us in the passage we just read that there is no relationship between S1 and S2, the one and the other. What, then, is this non-relation, this non-rapport, if you like, between S1 and S2, which, as Lacan says here, is not a chain? And where precisely do we see this non-relation, this non-rapport popping in Lacan's thought? I think these questions are crucial, but I also think that in order to begin answering them, we're going to have to read just a little further on page 69 of our packet. And we're going to need to stay just a little truer to our goal of counting to 3 with Lacan. When he says that he has learned from the error of his ways in the function and the field essay, what he says here is that what he's learned is what it means to decipher. And it's precisely this lesson that he wants to continue sharing with us on page 69. To decipher, he goes on to explain, is, quote, to substitute the signifier one for the other signifier. And this, if you ask me, is where the going gets tough in lesson 3 of seminar 21. But also where tough motherfuckers like you get going. So let's take a look, reading on from just where we left off in the seminar. It is to substitute the signifier one for the other signifier. Remember, he's trying to tell us what it means to decipher. This is what he thinks he's explaining to us. Hang on to your hats. He says it's to substitute the signifier one for the other signifier. The one that only makes 2 because you add the deciphering to it, which allows you right away to count 3. This does not prevent it being written, as I did, S index 2, because that is how it should be read, the formula of the link between S1 and S2. It is pure forcing, but it is not the forcing of a notion. This is what puts us under the yoke of knowledge. Since I am in the process of speaking to you about psychoanalysis, I add the yoke of knowledge at the very place of truth. This, Lacan concludes, is one of the pillars of psychoanalytic discourse. So let's see if we can make sense of this. It's a weird one. I'm not saying we're going to hit it out of the park, but I think we might be able to get a base out of this one. In place of S1, S2. In place of S2, S1. A couple of substitutions, if you like. And if you want to put them in the order that we've got here, in place of S2, we find S1. There's a substitution. And then from S1 back to S2, another substitution of sorts. And all, again, by way of deciphering, which Lacan says must be added to this process as an operational logic that is neither S1 nor S2, but instead a third element, which allows you right away, he says, to count to 3. It's an operational logic, Lacan adds, whose formulation is also, oddly enough, that of a link between S1 and S2. So let me try and get this straight. It ain't a chain, and it ain't even a relationship, but it allows us to formulate a link? So there is no relationship between S1 and S2, but nevertheless we can formulate a link there. What in God's name is Lacan talking about? The answer is exactly what you'd expect and exactly what he says in the passage we just continued reading. What is our boy talking about here? Psychoanalysis. Plain and simple. I am in the process of speaking to you about psychoanalysis, he says. Specifically, one of the pillars of psychoanalytic discourse. And this, I believe, is the clue we've been awaiting in order to conclude our count to 3. The clue here is the analytic discourse. Draw it with me again, one more time, just so we can take a look at this beloved analytic discourse. I go back to the pen tab, back to your screen, but this time with a different color for us to see the analytic discourse. I'm drawing it right now in all of its glory. And you know what? You've probably heard me talk about this so many times that you don't even need to look at the screen. You could close your eyes and probably see this bad boy popping up in full view. The analytic discourse is now on your screen just below the Borromean link or knot that we drew. I love this discourse, and so does Lacan. It's hella useful, and he wants to tell us about it here. Note in particular where you see S1 and S2 in this discourse, in this matheme. You see it in the matheme's lower half. There's our S1, call it linguistic meaning. There's our S2, call it unconscious knowledge. You see how this is shaping up? The passage we just read from Seminar 21 is not that weird and wonky when you follow Lacan's lead, when you listen to him, not somebody else, saying, I'm in the process of speaking to you about psychoanalysis, specifically one of the pillars of psychoanalytic discourse. That clues us in, aha, we're talking about the psychoanalytic discourse. And we draw the discourse, and what do we see? An odd trio at the bottom of this discourse. The S1 on display in the passage we just read as a figure of linguistic meaning, I'm telling you, is also that of the S1 that you see on your screen right now in the analytic discourse. And here it is S1 qua symptom. The S1 here, as you know, because you've been tuning into these series, it's the symptomatic statement produced when the analysand opens their mouth. Hence that downward arrow from /S to S1. That /S is again the garrulous analysand. And the S1 is the symptomatic statement that is produced when they speak, as an effect of their act and fact of saying. This is that symptomatic said that we've so discussed. And the S2 that we just talked about in Seminar 21, this is also the S2 that you see on your screen right now. The S2 at work in the passage we just read as a figure of unconscious knowledge, Lacan tells us, is the same S2 we see in the discourse on your screen, just as Lacan describes it here in the passage we read. It is unconscious knowledge in the place of truth. And that's what you see there in the lower left-hand corner of this matheme. That is the position in Lacanian theories of discourse that designates truth. We see unconscious knowledge, qua S2, in the position of truth, precisely as Lacan describes it in our packet on page 69. When the analysand speaks, I just told you what pops out. Symptomatic statements emerge. And they emerge not just at the behest of the speaking subject, but at the behest of unconscious truths. That's what you see in the arrow from S2 to /S and then down to S1. I add another color here so you can see this trajectory from S2 to /S to S1 that we've been over so many times. When the analysand speaks, symptomatic statements do indeed emerge, but at the behest of an unconscious truth, that S2 which commands the barred subject to speak. Here it is, S1 in place of S2, by way of the split subject, here represented by the /S. There's that substitution we were just messing with. And note what happens in the course of an analysis when the analysand is hystericized. When the analysand assumes the position of a split subject and starts to attend to these symptomatic statements, these S1s, inquiring after the unconscious truths that commanded them into existence, when they do this, they march S1 back to its constitutive S2. Here is the circuit from /S to S1 to S2 and back to /S that we see in the discourse of a hystericized analysand. And I'll draw it real quick so you can see. The discourse of the hysteric, when leveraged in analysis, gives us a certain circuit. And it's that circuit that I'm drawing on your screen right now. /S in the agential position, interrogating their symptomatic statements, there's S1, and producing as a result links to unconscious truth that then, all too often and all too unfortunately, become objects of surplus enjoyment for the hystericized analysand. We've talked about all this lots, but I throw it up here so that you can see what's happening again with S1 and S2, all in the context of analytic experience. The analysand is hystericized in the process of a psychoanalysis, Lacan tells us. Note, the ensuing dialectical link, if we can call it that, between S1 and S2 in this process, symptom and unconscious in this process. The ensuing dialectical link that is established between S1 and S2, symptom and unconscious, is something that must be added to these two elements. And note Lacan's use of set theory in the passage we just read to explain what this addition entails. He says there, it is pure forcing. Now what the hell is he on? What is pure forcing? What is he talking about here? All we're talking about doing was adding the deciphering component to the S1 and the S2. And now he's got pure forcing? Forcing, and you can look this up. This is not any big breakthrough, but it's from mathematics, not surprisingly. It's an axiomatic procedure used especially in set theory, mind you, that allows mathematicians to extend a given model or set by adding new elements in a controlled way, effectively forcing them to exist in an extended version of this model or set. That's what forcing means. That's what he's doing here with the mathematical turn to forcing, when he's describing what it means to add the deciphering to this dyadic relation between S1 and S2, thereby making it a triad. I think this is exactly what you see in Lacan's theory of discourse as he starts scaling it up in the late 1960s and as you see it culminating here in the early 1970s. It is a mathematical extension of his earlier model of the signifier. That's essentially what he's doing when he scales up discourse in the late 1960s, is he is forcing his earlier definition of the signifier to accommodate more elements. It's a logic, mathematical and otherwise, known as forcing here. Check it out. What is Lacan's definition of the signifier? From the early 1960s all the way up to his formulation of discourse in the late 1960s. He tells us there is one definition and only one definition of the signifier in his work. The signifier is what represents the subject to another signifier. That's the definition. And note, if you've seen our series on Seminar 16, we can draw this thing. You can actually map this. The signifier, S1, I write on your screen, is what represents the subject to another signifier. Look familiar? You've seen this before. Maybe it even brings back nightmares, traumatic and otherwise. Hell, I don't know. But this is his definition of the signifier. The signifier on your screen, S1, is what represents the subject on your screen /S to another signifier on your screen, S2. What I'm telling you here is that Lacan's theory of discourse, which culminates in the math theme of analytic discourse that you see on your screen in teal right now, it is a controlled, axiomatic extension of this basic model of the signifier. Hence, again, the title of Seminar 17, where Lacan really gets to work on this forcing of his definition of the signifier. What's the title of Seminar 17 again? Well, it comes to us in English as the other side of psychoanalysis. Another, perhaps better translation could have been the inverse of psychoanalysis. And the reason why I say that is because when you take the psychoanalytic discourse and you just turn it upside down, you see a different discourse, the discourse of the master. This is why so much of Seminar 17 is about the discourse of the master, because it is the other side of the discourse of the analyst. It is, if you look at the French title, the inverse of the discourse of the analyst. And again, just look at the discourse of the analyst on your screen right now. Take the whole thing and just turn it upside down. Leave the vectors in place and you've got the discourse of the master. The master's discourse is the inverse of the analyst's discourse. This is why so much of Seminar 17, the other side or the inverse of psychoanalysis, is about the master's discourse. Nothing new there. You've heard this before, not just for me. Other people notice this shit too. It's kind of clear. What matters here, though, for us, as we're talking through what Lacan is doing with the deciphering and forcing at the start of Seminar 21, is the following. The discourse of the master had to come next in Lacan's thinking. Why? Because the discourse of the master, where you see S1 addressing S2 and producing little a, note what I'm doing as I say this, I'm adding it to his definition of the signifier, and all at the behest of a slashed S. Do you see what I'm doing here? The discourse of the master is the next logical step in the extension of Lacan's formula for the signifier. S1 atop slashed S addressing S2. This is the next logical step in Lacan's forcing of his definition or his model of the signifier into something more complex, with more elements, with more moving parts, known not as the signifier, but as discourse. This is how Lacan thinks in the late 1960s, by way of forcing, pure forcing. And he's resurrecting that line of thought here in Seminar 21, in trying to bring us to some understanding of the non-rapport between S1 and S2 in the analytic discourse. Now, I'm sorry if that's kind of going a little fast and kind of loose here. Fuck, man, I mean, I wish we had time to just keep walking through this stuff. Say it again, say it better, but we don't. Thankfully, this shit is recorded. You can go back and check it out on your own. Let me say it again, say it better, just one more time to put us on the track. In the discourse of the master, we see S1 addressing S2 and producing little a, all at the behest of a slashed S. And what I'm here telling you is that that is the next logical step in the pure forcing by way of mathematical extension of Lacan's formula for the signifier that he cooked up about 10 years earlier, where the signifier is what represents the subject to another signifier. And you can even see Lacan queuing this up at the start of Seminar 17. He just says, and why don't we just add a little a to this thing and make it a four-footed animal instead? He just kind of willy-nilly throws it out there at the start of Seminar 17. Anyway, this is all in our series on 17. You can check it out. It's relevant here because it is an example of forcing. Note, and note carefully, between S1 and S2 in the master's discourse, there's a link, my friends, even if only an imaginary one. I left the arrow there. You can see it right here on your screen. I will circle it in another color so that you can remember exactly what we're showing here. In the master's discourse, we see a link of addressivity, even if only imaginary, between the master qua S1 and the slave, as it were, qua S2. There's a link between S1 and S2 in the master's discourse, even if only an imaginary one. But in the analytic discourse, check it out, it's still on your screen, there is no direct link between S1 and S2. Notice, in the analytic discourse, and I'll label it since we've got now 3 discourses on the screen. In the analytic discourse, we do not see a vector between S1 and S2. There is no arrow of addressivity. There is no link between these two things, except via indirection. And that's crucial. That is the crucial part of the analytic discourse, is that there is no direct link between S1 and S2. That's part of what happens when you inverse the master's discourse. You turn that shit upside down, and things change dramatically. Let me see if I can put this a little more technically. In the analytic discourse, between S1 and S2, there is a non-relation. Rather than saying there isn't anything there, it's more precise and accurate, I think, to say there is a non-relation there. In the analytic discourse, the discourse with which Lacan is teaching us how to count to 3 at the start of Seminar 21, what I'm telling you is that the third element between S1 and S2, the third which not only connects but also constitutes the two, albeit only ever in a differential link, is an impasse. The delta in green on your screen is an impasse. It is not an vector, it is not an arrow of adressivity, it is not an imaginary link, it's a fucking mountain range. I told you earlier to imagine objet A as a chasm, as a bottomless crack between any two entities. What we're now seeing here is a different type. Not a chasm, but an insurmountable mountain range, a barrier. And the word we use for this is impasse. There's an impasse between S1 and S2 in the analytic discourse. And notice, I've drawn it just as we've always drawn it, at least since Lacan started drawing it this way in Seminar 17, with that green triangle better known as a delta. It is a delta of impotence that, at the end of Seminar 19 in Lacan's report, has now been raised to the status of an impossibility, he says. And this, if you ask me, is the crucial piece of the puzzle that we've been working on here. It's the bottom half of the analytic discourse that has 3 elements: S2, S1, and a delta of impotence raised to the status of an impossibility, read impasse, in between. This is the third element. One is labeled 1, the other is labeled 2. I'm not going to write a 3 here, but rest assured, the figure of thirdness that we've been searching for is right here as an impasse between S1 and S2. And this is, again, precisely what makes this discourse, like all Lacanian discourses, a matheme, because it is structured around this logical impasse, this insurmountable mountain range. That is what Lacan's discourse fundamentally does. It links people together, but structurally, logically, its task is to scale up around the non-rapport. It is scaled up around logical impasse. It is scaled up around figures of impossibility. It is scaled up around that certain point that allows us to touch upon the real. So what do we get when we add this third element, which is effectively a figure of the non-rapport, of the relationship which is no such thing, as Lacan put it in the passage we read? What we get, at long last, again, is our third. The signifier 1 plus another does not equal 2, but instead 3, because we have to account for the non-relation between them. Indeed, the non-relation around which their dialectic and the broader discourse of the analyst, I'm telling you, is built. In order to count to 1, I'll say it again, you got to first count to 2. But in order to count to 2, you must first count to 3. Because without any gap, space, distance, difference, or non-rapport between the two, you'd only have 1. And this truly is what is impossible. This is going to get squirrely at the end. Hang on to that other hat of yours. When Lacan says again and again in the early 1970s that there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, this is what he means. There's no such thing as the one, even and especially where something of the one shows up. You see, thirdness may give us the mathematical figure of the impossible. You can see it on the screen right there. It's the only thing inked in green. And thus our point of access to the real. But the fundamental impossibility that this thing signals is that of oneness. You see, what's necessary is the multiple 3. We are only ever counting to 3, whether we know it or not, and even when we think we're counting to 4 instead. But what's impossible is the signifier 1. What's necessary is the multiple 3. But what's impossible is the signifier 1. But let me be very clear about this. It's precisely when the signifier 1 pops up nonetheless as an imaginary figure, frozen, composed, as a gestalt of some kind, that we see this impossibility. It is not so much the impossibility of signifying 1. It is the impossibility of its existence in the singular. So let's say it again. Let's say it better. What's necessary is the multiple 3, and all too often unsignified. What's impossible, however, is the singular 1 that we never stop signifying. So when Lacan says there's no relationship between linguistic meaning and unconscious knowledge, S1 and S2, here at the start of Seminar 21, I think this is what he means. He's saying that there is no such thing as oneness. To say the sexual relationship does not exist is to say that oneness is impossible. And that's the final note here. Thirdness is necessary. Oneness is impossible.